when innovation is still solving problems, and we have so many more problems than even during COVID. We have the war, we had all the supply chain problems, and we have a recession.
Kathy Wood seems very worried about a possible recession, but what exactly will cause this? Let's have a look.
So what I think we will look back in history and say, this inflation shock was the function of a supply shock caused by COVID, supply chain problems afterwards, and even more problems after Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
The real question is, have we seen anything similar to this in the past that can make us prepare for what's to come?
If I can just take 1 second, I would like to give an analogy to the late 19-teens. We were in the middle of the massive, most massive innovation the history of the world had seen. Telephone, electricity, and automobile, all at the same time. But we had World War I and we had the Spanish flu. Sound familiar? Now, that was much worse than what we've gone through. We've gone through nothing like that. But there were massive supply chain problems back then. And inflation peaked at 24%, right? In June of 1920. And by June of 1921, it was minus 15%.
Those who can't remember the past are condemned to repeat it. So how drastic will the inflation be? When will the recession start? And how worried should we be? Well, the more that I researched this, the more sinister it became.
So I think that our 8 to 10% inflation, which is where it was at the peak, is going to turn around, and we're going to see some very big surprises on the inflation front. And you know who agrees with us? The bond market. Look at what the bond market is doing now. The long bond yield, 380, 75% inverted. That's telling us that the bond market is saying recession and or big surprises on the low side of inflation expectations. And it's probably both.
Kathy is making very bold statements that sound very worrying, but what will the effect of the recession be on people's businesses? Let's have a look.
You talked about cost cutting and companies trimming. We've seen from the likes of Meta, hiring freezes there, other big names, Amazon and others, putting in place hiring freezes or indeed cutting jobs completely. How much bloodletting do you expect to see across the tech sector? How much more pain in terms of job cuts and in terms of reining in budgets?
Well, if you look at trendline employment gains, I think we're 9% above the trend that was in place pre-COVID. In other words, a lot of companies, and tech companies included, hired many more people than they should have, given what was going to ultimately happen to demand. And the first place you see a recession is in advertising, and the advertising budgets have been slashed. That's why, to me, hearing people say we're not in a recession and seeing advertising budgets cut in half by some companies is quite astonishing. And it's hitting the tech sector because so much of tech has become social media. We've seen one supply shock after another. It went much further than I expected. I expected the supply chain bottlenecks after COVID to clear up in 6 months. It's been 2 years, all right? I didn't expect, we didn't expect Russia to invade Ukraine, which is the breadbasket of Europe. And it's the energy source for a lot of Europe. So those are two major shocks. I think Europe's in recession, and we can't think about the US in isolation. Europe's probably in recession. China is, if we're looking at the micro numbers, China's very weak, very, very weak. And so everything's riding on the US. So the supply shocks, I think, are hurting purchasing power, as I said, in the US, could cause a recession. That will unwind the supply chain bottlenecks pretty quickly. And I think a lot of what we're seeing right now is a function of supply chain and supply shocks, very cyclical as well. And I think we'll see the other side of that. And then, as you say, we're seeing powerful deflationary forces associated with technology, artificial intelligence, training costs alone, and this is going to involve every industry, are dropping, if you consider both hardware and software, 60% per year. That's just one example of the deflationary undercurrents in the global economy. And so I think longer term, we're going to see significant surprises on the low side of expectations when it comes to inflation.
This inflation problem has been 12 to 15 months by the time the Fed started addressing it. And we think it's much more a function of supply chain imbalances caused by COVID and then again by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. These are very, very different circumstances. So what the Fed has done this time around is it has increased interest rates. If they go another 75 basis points, which is very likely on November 2nd, they will have increased interest rates from 0.25 to 4%. And that's a 16-fold increase. What did Volcker in the early 80s, he took interest rates from 10 to 20%. That's a twofold increase after consumers and businesses had gotten used to dealing with inflation and working around it over 15 years. This is a real shock to the system. And I do believe we will see the ramifications in many ways. We're seeing housing shutting down. And I think we're going to see a lot of other activities shutting down as well. We believe we're in a recession, and we believe this recession now will be sustained. And if we see an increase in GDP, it's probably because either inventories are continuing to increase or imports are coming down as companies try to unwind their inventories.
At the same time, many people are saying we're going into a recession. Now, we think we've been in a recession, and that the negative numbers will reassert themselves after this positive third quarter, mostly because of the inventory overhang, and we need to clear that out. I think many forecasters may say, oh, this is going to last forever, this recession through. We think it's just a major inventory correction, and then we'll be on our way again.
So a short-lived recession is what you're forecasting?
Sure. Well, we believe it started at the beginning of this year. So if it ends in the middle of next year or the third quarter, it's not so short-lived. It's only short-lived given that, that many people in a midterm election year don't agree that we're in recession now.
As you know, we've been saying we're in a recession for quite some time now. Now the statistics are bearing it out. Not employment statistics yet, and we'll get into that in a moment, but the GDP statistics. So real GDP growth has been negative for 2 consecutive quarters. Now that's what I've always viewed as a technical recession. Usually there's not much pushback to that, but there has been this time around. But one of the confirmations that we're in a recession are the leading indicators. So there's a leading indicator index that the government puts out every month. And whenever it has shown 3 consecutive months of decline, as it has, we have been in a recession. So we got that confirmation as well.
Kathy, so do you see a severe recession? And then how long do you think this bear market will continue?
Well, what's interesting, I think many people are coming around to the idea that we're in a recession or we're going into a recession. The first 2 quarters with real GDP growth negative to us means we're in a recession. And now that many people are worried and are beginning to see recession for as far as the eye can see, we are looking at this recession a little bit differently. We think it's going to be a function of this massive inventory overhang, and that it's going to be a serious inventory correction, but it's not going to be anything like we saw in 08, 09. That was a systemic financial problem caused by the mortgage and financial meltdown. We don't think this is the same thing. So now that many economists are starting to agree with us that we're in a recession or going into a recession, we feel that they might become a little bit too alarmist if this is just an inventory recession. And I think the Fed will have a lot to do with whether or not it is. This is a shock, though, to the system. And this idea that we have an inventory overhang, we think it's going to get bigger as consumers pull back. Low saving rates, 3.5% versus 8% where it was before COVID. And so we'll see. We think this holiday season is going to be pretty tough.
When innovation is still solving problems, and we have so many more problems than even during COVID. We have the war, we had all the supply chain problems, and we have a recession, which is going to force most companies to say, how do I increase productivity? How do I cut costs? Technology is usually the answer. So I think we're coming into a moment, hopefully many moments, where innovation is solving problems and our revenue growth rates are going to surpass by far the revenue growth rates that the overall economy will deliver.
So fiscal policy is a big drag on the economy right now. Monetary policy, so we've gone from 27% money growth on a year-over-year basis in mid-2020 down to 5.9% in June. It looks like July will be in the low fives. And if you look at the money numbers sequentially, what you will find is they have flattened out for the last few months. Now, if that were to be sustained, that trend or lack of a trend, then we would be working down to 0% money growth over the next six months or so, and possibly negative. Some people do believe the money growth rate will go negative. And if it does, I believe that will be the first time since the Great Depression in the 30s. And of course, that would also represent a tremendous drag on economic activity. So we've got both sides of policy, fiscal and monetary policy, really moving in a pro-cyclical manner. What that means is typically in a recession, they'd be counter-cyclical. You'd be stimulating. They're doing the opposite this time around. And I think that's why a lot of people are going to be surprised at this idea that we actually are in a recession.
We're already seeing trade drop off quite significantly. And I think that's going to be, we believe we're in a recession and trade's part of the reason. Now, interestingly, in the third quarter, if we see a positive GDP, it will be because trade is collapsing, meaning imports falling much faster than exports. And so that helps our GDP in a strange way. And the reason it's happening is we have an inventory glut. So companies are, if you look at Nike's report a couple of weeks ago, global sales up 3.5%, something like that. Their inventories globally up 44%. Their inventories in North America up 68%. And their inventories in transit, probably mostly from China, up 85%. So, it's overwhelming what's going on. And so we're trying to cut back on imports. That's going to back up into these other countries as well. So we think our recession, we think the globe is in a recession, and the dollar is exacerbating the pain. Food commodities are priced in dollars, and, these other currencies around the world are unwinding and just making it very difficult for populations. The Fed tipped its hat to this in some of its last speeches, different members, Powell included. But I think, if we want to remain the reserve currency, this is, I don't think, the way to do it long run.
The other reason I think we're in a recession, and we've talked about this, we won't go into it too much, but the inventory buildup that Walmart and Target and Home Depot, Costco, all of them were describing in their April quarters. they do not seem to have gotten them under control if the macro indicators are any indication. We've got on both the wholesale and the retail level, month-to-month increases in the 1.5% to 2% range. Now, if GDP is revised up, and it could even be revised into positive territory because of inventories, that won't take us off of this recession, this thought that we're in a recession, because inventories are piling up because consumers are shutting down.